The jungle below was nothing but a black ocean. No moon, no stars. Just the low thrum of helicopter blades slicing through the heavy Vietnam night. Inside the aircraft, the crew sat in silence, each man carrying the same quiet fear. Once the sun went down, the enemy owned everything. "All right, switch 'em on," the pilot said. The gunner pulled the experimental goggles over his eyes. A faint click. Then the world exploded into red. Not green like the night vision they were used to. Not grainy or soft. This was sharper, deeper. A strange crimson world, as if everything around them was glowing from somewhere beneath the surface. "Sir, this is wild," the gunner whispered, adjusting the focus. "Everything looks alive." They drifted over a silent line of treetops. Fog rolled over the canopy like breath from something sleeping below. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. The 50 cal roared to life, shaking the entire aircraft. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" The pilot yanked the controls as tracers tore across the empty night sky. "What the hell are you doing?" The gunner didn't answer. His whole body trembled as he kept staring into the red haze. "It was right there," he finally stammered. Something was right beside us, keeping pace. His voice cracked. It was looking straight at me. The pilot exchanged a look with his co-pilot. Not anger, but dread. They had flown hundreds of missions. They had seen fear before, but not like this. The gunner slowly removed the goggles. The normal darkness rushed back in, empty and quiet. "There's nothing out there," the co-pilot said, trying to sound steady. The gunner shook his head. "No," he whispered, "not in your world." The rotors hummed. The jungle swallowed their sound. And whatever the gunner had seen never showed itself again. But it had already left its mark. And this was only the beginning. There is a moment just before true darkness settles, where the world changes, shapes stretch, shadows breathe, and the quiet becomes something alive. Most of us pass through that moment without noticing it, but soldiers learn to recognize it, because in the dead of night, the battlefield is no longer made of trees and dirt and steel. It becomes something else entirely. A place where the human eye is no longer the highest authority. For as long as we've gone to war, we've tried to push back against the dark. Torches, flares, radar, goggles. Tools meant to expose the enemy hiding in the places we cannot see. But every time we build a new lens, every time we invent a way to brighten the night, we risk revealing more than we intended. Some technologies show us our threats, others show us our weaknesses, and a few, the strange few, force us to question what reality even looks like when stripped of its familiar colors. Because if the world we know is only visible through one narrow window, what else waits on the other side of the glass? This is the space between certainty and fear, between what we believe and what soldiers swear they've seen. A place where science struggles to keep up with experience and where the mind becomes the final battlefield. Beyond this point lies a story of machines built to help us see, and the things those machines revealed that were never meant for human eyes. For most people, darkness is an inconvenience. You flip a switch, turn on a lamp, and the world returns. But in the military, darkness is a battlefield of its own. It decides who moves, who hides, who survives. And long before night vision goggles became common, soldiers learned the hard way that the night does not forgive mistakes. In Vietnam, the jungle didn't just look dark. It swallowed light. Trees formed walls that absorbed everything. Cloud cover erased the moon. Even the stars were stolen by the canopy. Walk 3 steps away from your squad, and you vanished. So when the first night vision devices arrived, they felt like miracles. Not perfect, not even close, but better than walking blind into an ambush you never saw coming. Most soldiers wore a single optic over one eye, a green glowing window into a strange version of reality. One eye saw the world as it truly was, pitch black. The other saw it through a grainy lens that brightened shadows and exposed movement. At first, it feels unnatural. Your brain doesn't like processing 2 different worlds at the same time. But after hours, sometimes days, of staring through the lens, something strange happens. Your mind begins to blend the 2 images. The darkness and the green glow merge into a kind of hybrid reality. A place that looks real, but doesn't feel real. Edges disappear, shapes bend, branches sway in ways that aren't caused by the wind. Shadows flicker even when nothing is moving. And when you're exhausted, really exhausted, the line between perception and imagination becomes dangerously thin. Soldiers have described seeing figures crouched behind trees, only to flip up the optic and find nothing there. Others swore they saw silhouettes walking along ridgelines, but when they blinked, the shapes dissolved into fog. Some spoke to people who weren't there. Some heard footsteps in the undergrowth that stopped the instant they removed the lens. This isn't superstition. It is the human brain struggling to interpret a world it was never designed to see. Night vision goggles amplify what little light exists, but they also magnify your fear, your fatigue, and your assumptions. In the dead of night, those distortions can feel real enough to pull a trigger, and so a truth formed among the men who used them. Night vision doesn't just reveal what's out there, it reveals what your mind is trying to hide. But all of this, the grainy glow, the strange blending of images, the harmless illusions, belonged to standard green spectrum night vision. The prototypes tested in Vietnam were something else entirely. A new color, a new wavelength, a new way of seeing the world. And when the brain already struggles to handle the ordinary green glow, what happens when you show it something the human eye was never meant to process? The soldiers who tested those goggles would soon learn the answer. Not through theory, not through training, but in the sky, over a silent jungle, where the night is thick enough to hide anything, even things we don't believe in. Long before the red spectrum prototypes of Vietnam, armies around the world had already learned one cruel truth. If you cannot see at night, you cannot fight at night. During World War II, both the Axis and Allied forces tried to solve this problem. The German military developed some of the first infrared night vision systems, massive, awkward devices mounted onto tanks and rifles. They were called active infrared scopes because they required a powerful infrared spotlight to illuminate the battlefield. To human eyes, the spotlight was invisible, but to the scope, the world lit up like daylight, sharp, bright, and deadly. The problem was weight and visibility. The equipment was huge. The spotlight drained batteries quickly. And worst of all, enemy soldiers could detect the infrared beam with their own early optics. If you used the system, you might as well have painted a target on your vehicle. The Americans tried their own version, the sniper scope and snooper scope. They worked, but only at short distances. They were clumsy to carry, and when the weather turned humid or foggy, the scopes became nearly useless. Still, these early efforts proved one thing: seeing in the dark was possible. By the time the Korean War ended, engineers knew night vision was the future. The only question was how to make it practical, Small enough for a rifle, sensitive enough for a pilot, reliable enough for a soldier crawling through the jungle. Then came Vietnam, and Vietnam exposed every weakness in American night fighting capability. The Viet Cong moved like ghosts. They traveled by night, hid by day, and used the dense jungle to conceal everything. Troops, weapons, supply lines. They knew the terrain better than anyone, and darkness gave them full control. American commanders began repeating a phrase that echoed through every fire base: "The enemy owns the night." It wasn't an exaggeration. Ambushes came at dusk. Booby traps were set after sunset. Entire battalions disappeared into the tree line before morning reports. Helicopter crews, the lifeline of the war, were especially vulnerable. Flying at night meant guessing where the treetops ended and the sky began. Landing zones vanished into shadow. Pilot error became as dangerous as enemy fire. America had air power, firepower, technology, but none of it mattered once the sun went down. So the pressure grew. Washington wanted results. Scientists needed breakthroughs. Soldiers demanded tools that could save their lives. It was no longer enough to have early infrared systems or bulky scopes from the last war. Vietnam required something completely new. A passive night vision device. Something that didn't need a spotlight. Something that could amplify the faintest glimmer of starlight. Something small enough to wear. Something powerful enough to turn the night into an ally instead of an enemy. This urgency, this desperation, pushed researchers toward radical experiments. New wavelengths, new chemical coatings, new lenses that bent light in ways no soldier had ever experienced. Some of those experiments led to the Starlight Scope. Others led to the first-generation NVGs, and a few, the most secretive, the most experimental, the most rushed, produced devices that were never meant to be widely issued. Devices that filtered the world through red, not green. Devices that showed soldiers things no one could explain. Things that weren't in any manual, any lab report, any scientific paper. Vietnam didn't just push night vision forward, it pushed it into territory no one was prepared for. And the men chosen to test those early prototypes would soon discover why. By the mid-1960s, American engineers were running out of time. Vietnam had exposed a dangerous truth. Even the best soldiers in the world were nearly helpless once the sun went down. Every patrol, every convoy, every flight after dark became a gamble, and no commander wanted to keep gambling. So the search began for something beyond traditional green illumination, something sharper, something faster, something more adaptable to the chaotic mix of fog, jungle canopy, and low starlight. In secret labs across the country, researchers started pushing night vision technology beyond its limits. Every wavelength of light was tested: infrared, near infrared, low frequency red. Even wavelengths that had barely been studied in a military context. Most of these experiments went nowhere. Some made images too blurry, others strained the eyes. A few were promising, but only under perfect conditions, the kind Vietnam never offered. Then came the idea, what if the green spectrum wasn't the only answer? What if another color, another range of light could cut through darkness in ways no soldier had seen before? This question led to a series of trials using red spectrum filters. Red light interacts differently with the rods in the human eye. It causes less fatigue. It preserves natural night vision better. And under the right conditions, red wavelengths can create higher contrast between objects and background terrain. On paper, it made sense. In the lab, it looked promising. So the army moved forward. But unlike the Starlight scope, large, slow, and limited, these new devices were meant to be worn, not held, not mounted. Worn like goggles. They were experimental, fragile, and produced in very small numbers. Only a handful of units received them, and those units were chosen carefully. The first group selected was not infantry, not forward observers, not ground patrols. It was helicopter crews. Pilots needed situational awareness. Door gunners needed to track movement on the ground, and medevac teams needed to land in places where even the moon could not reach. The goggles were delivered quietly. No briefings for the entire squadron, no formal announcements, just a simple message passed through officers. Test these, record your observations, report back. Most soldiers didn't even know the program existed. The devices arrived in plain crates, without markings, without official designations. They weren't listed on equipment rosters or maintenance logs. To the crews who received them, the goggles looked unusual, sleeker than the bulky scopes they were used to, with a faint red tint to the lenses. Engineers claimed the red spectrum could reveal sharper detail in low light conditions, especially from altitude. It wasn't about superstition. It wasn't about bending physics. It wasn't about anything beyond tactics. The mission was simple: give pilots and gunners a fighting chance at night. And if these goggles worked, even partially, they could change the war. But field testing is never gentle, and the Vietnam jungle was the harshest testing ground imaginable. Soon, the first flights began, and with them, the first signs that something was wrong. Not with the equipment, not with the engineering, but with what the men saw the moment they put the goggles on. The first night the prototypes were tested, the air felt heavier than usual. Not because of weather or enemy activity, or the long hours. They were used to all of that. It was the goggles. Everyone on the crew knew they were carrying something unproven, something uncertain. The door gunner, a young man barely in his 20s, turned the device over in his hands as they lifted off the pad. The lenses looked darker than normal NVGs, almost tinted with smoke. "Go ahead," the pilot said. "Let's see what these things can do." The gunner lowered the strap, slid the goggles into place, and clicked them on. At once, the world shifted. It wasn't green, it wasn't grainy, it wasn't soft or fuzzy, like the Starlight scope they had tried weeks earlier. Everything was crimson. The jungle below didn't look like terrain. It looked like a vast, breathing surface. Dark veins of treetops stretched across a red haze that pulsed with faint, unnatural light. "Jesus," the gunner whispered. "It looks clear. Too clear." "Define too clear," the co-pilot said, watching him. "I can see every branch, every ridge. Depth just feels weird, like everything is closer than it should be." That caught the pilot's attention. Depth perception was everything. A mistake at night could slam a helicopter into the canopy before anyone realized what happened. "Keep it together. Just observe," the pilot said. "We'll only be up 20 minutes. But the gunner wasn't hearing him. He leaned forward, pressing one gloved hand against the frame of the doorway, staring into the red-tinted world below. The helicopter pushed deeper over the forest, where fog rose in slow waves from the undergrowth. Through the red spectrum, the fog didn't look soft. It looked alive, like strands of glowing smoke reaching up towards the aircraft. "Sir," the gunner said quietly, "there's movement down there." The pilot scanned with his naked eye and saw nothing but darkness. "Where?" 3 o'clock low, no higher, more like tree level. The crew chief leaned over to check. "What do you see?" The gunner paused. A long breath. Then another. "Something's pacing us," he said, keeping speed. The pilot's head snapped around. "What do you mean something?" Before the gunner could answer, rat-tut-tut-tut-tut-tut. The 50 cal erupted, shaking the entire airframe. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" The co-pilot reached back, grabbing the gunner by his harness, trying to pull him off the trigger. The pilot jerked the helicopter up and left, terrified of hitting another aircraft in the formation. "What the hell are you shooting at?" the pilot yelled. The gunner finally released the grips, chest heaving, breath trembling. "It was right there," he whispered. "I swear to God. It had wings." "Wings?" "Yes, big ones, like a shape coming out of the fog. It was staring at me." The crew exchanged glances. Men didn't talk like that unless something was seriously wrong. "Have you been taking anything?" the co-pilot asked carefully. "Anything issued? Anything not issued?" The gunner shook his head violently. "No, sir, I'm not high. I'm not tired. I'm telling you what I saw." But the pilot wasn't convinced. Too many guys had cracked under pressure. Too many had turned to pills or local drugs just to stay awake. "We'll talk after landing," he said. "For now, nobody touches those goggles." The rest of the flight was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The gunner just stared at the floor, hands shaking as if still feeling the recoil of the gun in his bones. And though the pilot didn't say it out loud, a single uneasy thought kept creeping back. He had seen the gunner's face before he fired. That wasn't the face of a man hallucinating. That was the face of someone who believed completely that something was coming for him. What the pilot didn't know was that this was only the start, because the next crews who tested the goggles would report the exact same thing. The Army expected turbulence in the testing phase, equipment failures, visual distortions, maybe a few complaints about eye strain. What they didn't expect was a pattern. Within the first week, the reports began spreading quietly, crew to crew, whispered in hangars and over late-night coffee. No one filed official paperwork. No one wanted to sound unstable. But the stories were too strange and too similar to ignore. On the second flight test, another gunner froze mid-mission, refusing to touch his weapon even when ordered. "There's something moving in the canopy," he said, voice shaking, jumping from tree to tree. The pilot looked with his naked eyes. Nothing. Just a dark, endless roof of leaves. But through the red spectrum goggles, the gunner saw shapes, dark silhouettes with long limbs crossing the air between branches in unnatural strides. "Sir, they're keeping up with us, on both sides." The pilot told him to breathe, to focus, to flip the goggles up. The moment he did, the shapes vanished. He refused to put them back on. By the third week, the stories got worse. A crew chief reported seeing faces in the fog, pale, hollow shapes drifting just outside the cabin door, as if watching the aircraft pass overhead. "They weren't human," he whispered. "I don't care what you tell me. That wasn't fog." One pilot, a man known for his calm under pressure, ripped the goggles off mid-flight and threw them onto the floor. "I'm not wearing those things again," he said. Something looked back at me. The co-pilot laughed at first, until he tried the goggles himself. He didn't last 5 seconds. He flipped them on, leaned forward, and jerked his head away like he'd been slapped. "Turn this bird around," he said quietly. "We're done." When the pilot asked what he saw, the co-pilot refused to describe it. He only said, "It knew I could see it." Fear spreads faster than facts. Within days, Crews were avoiding the goggles entirely. Some hid them under spare flight suits. Others pretended they were malfunctioning. A few swore at their officers when ordered to test them. These weren't rookies. These were experienced airmen, men who'd flown into hot zones, landed under fire, carried wounded friends back to safety. But nothing in the war had affected them like this. The behavior changes were unmistakable. Paranoia. Men looked over their shoulders, even in daylight, as if something might still be following them. Sleeplessness. Some refused to sleep without lights on, something unheard of in Vietnam. Fatigue. They were worn down, jumpy, easily startled. Isolation. A few avoided talking about the flights entirely, as if describing what they saw would make it real. One mechanic overheard two gunners talking in the early morning hours. "Do you think it was in the trees?" one asked. "No," the other replied quietly. "It was above us." Word spread across the base in hushed tones, but officially, nothing was wrong. There were no notes in mission logs, no formal complaints, no requests to halt testing. The army had no idea what was happening in those helicopters, but the men knew something was off. Something was wrong. Something was being seen that wasn't supposed to be seen, and whatever the cause, equipment failure, stress, or something far stranger, the effect was undeniable. The red spectrum goggles were breaking the crews. One man finally summed it up best. "You can take my rifle, you can take my rations, but don't make me wear those goggles again." Before jumping to conclusions about what the men saw, it helps to understand what the human eye actually is and what it isn't. We like to think our vision is reliable, that if we see something, it must be real. But biologically, the human eye is a fragile, imperfect tool. Especially in the dark, inside our eyes are two types of receptors: cones, which handle color and detail, and rods, which handle low light and motion. In daylight, cones dominate. They give us sharp, detailed images. At night, rods take over, but rods cannot see color. They only detect shapes and movement. This alone creates a problem. In darkness, the brain receives incomplete information. It must fill in the gaps with pattern recognition, memory, and instinct. Now imagine taking that delicate system and asking it to interpret a battlefield. Red light and depth distortion. When the army tested red spectrum goggles, they didn't do it for supernatural reasons. They did it because red wavelengths interact with rods in a very specific way. Red light maintains night vision. Red light causes less eye fatigue. Red light increases contrast between dark objects. Red light creates a more dramatic foreground-background separation. On paper, this sounds ideal, but there's a downside the engineers didn't anticipate. Red light collapses depth perception. Objects appear closer. Shadows look like solid forms. Fog becomes textured, almost layered. Branches blend into shapes that don't behave like normal foliage. It is the perfect recipe for misinterpretation. In normal green NVGs, the brain adjusts over hours. But in red spectrum testing, the brain had zero reference point. It was like being dropped into an alien world with unfamiliar rules. Combine this with motion, like flying over jungle, and the result is a visual system pushed beyond its limits. The brain fills in what it cannot understand. When the eyes see something unclear, the brain does not simply accept, "I don't know what that is." It guesses. And in high-stress environments, the brain guesses aggressively. A faint shadow becomes a crouching figure. A branch bending becomes movement. Fog thickening becomes a shape with form and intention. This is called pareidolia. the mind imposing meaning onto chaos. Soldiers in every war have reported this. From Roman sentries to modern infantry, human perception under darkness and stress is notoriously unreliable. The red goggles magnified this effect. They didn't just brighten the night, they changed the visual rules entirely. Fatigue, the silent enemy. Modern readers often underestimate what Vietnam soldiers endured. Multi-day patrols, monsoon, humidity, minimal sleep, constant threat of ambush, malnutrition, psychological stress, terrifying night flights. Sleep deprivation alone can cause hallucinations. And then there were the pills. Stay awake, pills. Meth in military bottles. Many Vietnam veterans later revealed that they were issued tablets their commanders called stay awake pills. They were told the medication would help them remain alert on long missions, especially night operations. But when some soldiers brought the pills home and had them examined, they learned the truth. They were amphetamines, real methamphetamine. This drug floods the brain with stress chemicals, suppresses sleep, increases paranoia, heightens sensitivity to light and sound, magnifies fear, distorts time perception, triggers visual hallucinations when combined with exhaustion. Put simply, these men were being pushed into a chemical state where illusions were inevitable. Now imagine pairing that with red spectrum goggles and a black jungle stretching endlessly in every direction. The environment was a perfect storm. Case study 1. Hallucinating soldiers. A former Marine recalled being on patrol and speaking to a man walking beside him through his NVGs. He had a full conversation, but the moment he flipped the goggles up, the man vanished. He had been talking to no one. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't trembling. He simply believed what his eyes showed him through the lens. This is identical to what Vietnam helicopter crews described. Case study 2. The Starlight Scope Illusions. The US Navy later documented a series of visual distortions produced by the early Starlight Scope. Snakes appearing enormous rats, looking like human silhouettes. Bushes, walking, fog, rippling as if alive, distant corpses seen on the ground that were not there. In daylight, flashes of light that appeared like movement, distorted edges, reaching into the frame. A historian wrote that the green glow created a landscape resembling an LSD hallucination, even for sober soldiers. If this was the effect under standard green optics, then what would happen with red spectrum lenses untested in combat conditions? Case study 3. Seeing movement. Where none exists, scientific studies show that when a soldier is stressed, exhausted, and placed in a visually ambiguous environment, their brain becomes hypersensitive to motion. This is an evolutionary survival mechanism. If the jungle sways slightly, the brain amplifies it. If fog thickens, the brain treats it like a form emerging. If branches shift, the brain assigns intentional movement. Combine this with rotor wash from a helicopter disturbing the canopy, and a normal soldier might interpret dozens of false threats as living things. In other words, the human mind becomes an enemy of its own stability. So why did soldiers see monsters? Not because monsters were confirmed, not because optics were magical, but because the goggles changed wavelengths, the red tint erased depth. The jungle was dense and shifting. The aircraft was moving quickly. The brain was exhausted. Amphetamines altered perception, stress, amplified fear. Darkness concealed familiar reference points. The mind filled in details that didn't exist. Soldiers were operating in sensory overload. Under these conditions, the line between reality and illusion becomes razor thin. Give someone the wrong wavelength, the wrong level of fatigue, and the wrong environment, and the brain will create shapes with wings, faces in fog, and silhouettes that leap between trees, not because they are real, but because the mind cannot bear uncertainty in the dark. Yet even with all this science, even with all this logic grounded in biology and psychology, there remained one troubling detail. Multiple soldiers described the same shapes, in different helicopters, on different nights, under different levels of fatigue. That single fact is what unsettled the men most. And it is why this story does not end here. Science explains a lot about what the soldiers saw. Fatigue, stress, red light distortion, chemical stimulants, all of it contributes to hallucinations. And yet, there is another side to this story. A quieter, more uncomfortable question that lingers beneath the surface. What if the goggles weren't malfunctioning, but revealing? To understand why some researchers take this possibility seriously, we have to examine the limits of human sight itself. Human vision, a narrow window. We move through the world believing we see everything around us, but biologically, our eyes only detect a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, a thin sliver of wavelengths we call visible light. Above it lies ultraviolet. Below it lies infrared. Further out lie X-rays, gamma rays, radio waves, microwaves. A vast universe of energy, motion, and structure completely invisible to the naked eye. We don't see these worlds. We only see what our biology allows. And that limitation has shaped every assumption we've ever made about reality. If something exists outside our visual range, we don't perceive it. We don't track it. We don't acknowledge it. Not because it isn't real, but because we can't see it. Wavelengths that reveal the invisible. When scientists began developing early night vision devices, they were essentially teaching the human eye to see energy that normally slips by unnoticed. Infrared optics show heat signatures, life glowing in total darkness. UV sensors reveal patterns on plants, minerals, and animal fur that appear completely plain to us. Different wavelengths reveal different worlds. Infrared shows movement and heat. Ultraviolet reveals structural details and markings. Near-infrared exposes hidden surfaces. Red spectrum amplification creates contrast layers not visible in normal light. These tools do not create illusions. They expose what was already there, just beyond our natural limits. The question then becomes, what else is out there, invisible simply because we lack the biology to detect it? Historical attempts. Kilner's screens. At the turn of the 20th century, a British medical researcher named Walter John Kilner attempted something radical. He believed the human body emitted an energetic aura, invisible to the naked eye, but potentially detectable with the right filter. He created special glass plates treated with a chemical dye called dianin. When subjects were viewed through these screens, some observers reported seeing faint outlines around the body, glowing layers extending inches beyond the skin. Most of the scientific community rejected Kilner's work, dismissing it as optical illusion. But a few researchers noticed something interesting. Kilner didn't invent the effect. He simply found a wavelength that made it visible. Whether or not the aura existed wasn't the point. The point was that changing the wavelength of incoming light revealed structures the unaided eye could not detect. And when later generations of scientists experimented with UV and IR photography, they discovered animals leave invisible trails, insects have hidden markings, minerals fluoresce, plant structures change color, heat maps reveal movement, all invisible to us unless viewed through the correct filter. Animals see what humans cannot. We tend to think human vision is standard. It isn't. Many creatures see far beyond our capabilities. Birds detect ultraviolet signatures. Insects see complex UV patterns on leaves and flowers. Snakes perceive heat in near infrared. Cats and dogs detect movement and faint shapes. Humans miss entirely. Fish see polarized light underwater. Evolution gave them access to worlds we never see. So when a soldier says, "It was right beside us," but only visible through the goggles, the idea is not scientifically impossible. It is simply unfamiliar. What red spectrum optics actually do, unlike the green phosphor system used in modern NVGs, the early red spectrum prototypes amplified specific wavelengths that interact strongly with darkness and fog. These wavelengths boosted contrast between moving and static objects, revealed structural outlines in dense air, exaggerated edges, and shadow forms cut through mist by highlighting refracted particles, created false surfaces where light scattered unusually. Fog, for example, became textured, almost sculpted, because red wavelengths highlighted density variations invisible to standard vision. That means a soldier might have perceived shapes not because they were hallucinating, but because the goggles revealed structures normally hidden within the darkness. Whether those structures were natural or something else, that remains the mystery. The unsettling possibility: if night vision goggles amplify light, and different wavelengths expose different layers of reality, then what happens when you use an untested wavelength over a living, breathing jungle? A jungle full of heat movement, moisture, airborne particles, microorganisms, shifting shadows, invisible waves of thermal energy. Under certain wavelengths, these elements could create forms that appear solid, intentional, alive. But here is the problem. The soldiers didn't describe random shapes. They described consistent shapes. Winged silhouettes, long-limbed figures, faces hovering in red haze. Different crews, different nights, different levels of fatigue. Yet the descriptions were strikingly similar. That is what makes this section of the story difficult to dismiss. If the goggles were simply malfunctioning, the distortions would have been random, chaotic, unpredictable. But instead, the shapes followed the aircraft, matched speed, turned when it turned, appeared almost aware. Which leads to the question that has haunted this story for decades. Did the goggles reveal hallucinations created by the brain, or something the human eye was never meant to see? The answer, for one officer, came the moment he decided to try the goggles himself. And what he witnessed would end the program almost instantly. By the end of the month, the experimental optics had become a quiet problem no one wanted to acknowledge. Pilots whispered about them in the mess hall. Crew chiefs avoided eye contact when officers mentioned testing. Gunners, once eager for any tactical advantage, now treated the goggles like cursed objects. But the written reports? They said nothing, not a word. Because if a soldier admitted he saw shapes with wings, his career could end on the spot. And if an officer admitted multiple crews were panicking over the same hallucinations, he risked shutting down a program the Army desperately wanted to succeed. That is why Major William Carter, the man in charge of the testing unit, finally reached a breaking point. He wasn't a rookie. He had served in Korea. He had flown over hostile lines. He had seen fear, real fear, in the eyes of men facing death. But what he saw on the faces of his helicopter crews was something different. It wasn't fear of the enemy. It wasn't fear of the jungle. It was fear of something they couldn't name, and that bothered him deeply. So one night, long after the maintenance crews had gone to sleep, Carter asked his co-pilot to take one of the birds up for a short flight. No announcements, he said. No scheduled test. Just us. He carried one pair of the red spectrum goggles, the same pair that had caused 2 gunners to freeze and another to open fire into the night sky. They lifted off the pad, rising into the humid darkness. The jungle below was still, a heavy, unmoving ocean of black. "All right," Carter said quietly, adjusting the strap. "Let's see what's causing all this trouble." He took a breath, lowered the goggles, and switched them on. The world shifted instantly. Everything snapped into a deep crimson glow. Not bright, not overwhelming, just wrong. The treetops didn't look like foliage, they looked like muscle, stretched over the rolling shape of the jungle. Fog drifted upward in slow, pulsing ribbons, like breath from something sleeping beneath the canopy. Even the air felt different, like it was alive. Carter steadied himself against the doorway. "Sir, you okay?" the co-pilot asked. "Yes, this is strange." But he couldn't look away. The red world felt unnatural, as if he had stepped into a place where normal rules didn't apply. They flew further out, away from the base lights, into deeper darkness. That's when Carter noticed it. A disturbance in the tree line, a shift, a ripple, large, deliberate. "Hold altitude," Carter said. His voice came out softer than he intended. He leaned forward, adjusting the focus. Something moved, not wind, not a bird, not rotor wash. Something large was climbing up toward the canopy. "What do you see?" the co-pilot asked. Carter didn't answer. He couldn't, because from the red-tinted haze, a shape began to rise, slowly, silently, emerging from the treetops like a figure rising from water, long limbs, a hunched back, wings that stretched wider than any bird found in Vietnam. Not flapping, gliding, carried by some invisible current. And worst of all, it wasn't alone. Another shape moved beside it. Then another, climbing, ascending, coming toward the helicopter, their forms sharpening as the red glow intensified around them. Carter felt his chest tighten. "These aren't illusions," he whispered. The shapes continued to rise, guided by the fog, as if the mist itself was lifting them upward. Their outlines became clearer, too clear. Faces, eyes, expressions that shouldn't exist in anything made of flesh or shadow. They were close, too close. Carter tore the goggles off. Darkness, silence, nothing, no shapes, no wings, no movement. Just the jungle, still and empty. His hands shook. "Sir?" the co-pilot asked again, his voice cracking. "What did you see?" Carter didn't answer. He couldn't put it into words. He had gone up expecting to prove his men were hallucinating. Instead, he had seen the same forms, with more clarity and far more detail. He sat back in his seat, breathing hard, gripping the goggles like they were something venomous. "Take us home," he said quietly. "Major?" "Now." They flew back in silence. When they landed, Carter walked straight to the maintenance shed, locked the goggles in an unmarked case, and wrote a single line in his notebook. "Program unsafe. Terminate immediately." It wasn't fear that guided his decision. It was certainty. Whatever those goggles revealed, illusion or not, no soldier should ever see it again. Major Carter didn't call a meeting. He didn't file a complaint. He didn't request a debriefing with higher command. He simply walked off the flight line with the goggles in his hand and made a decision he knew would never appear in any official record. By morning, the experimental optics program was dead. Not with an announcement, not with a memo, not with a report stamped classified. It ended the way most dangerous ideas die in wartime. Quietly, quietly, quietly. No paper trail. The army liked its paperwork. Every weapon, every tool, every bolt had a number, a form, an entry in a log. But not these goggles. They had arrived without documentation. They would disappear the same way. Carter placed the prototypes in a locked storage crate, sealed it, and handed it off to a supply officer without explanation. "Where should these go, sir?" "Somewhere safe," Carter said. That was all. There would be no test summary, no evaluation, no request for further modification. The goggles simply vanished. Crews slowly relaxed, but not fully. When word spread, unofficially through glances and whispers, that testing had stopped, the mood across the airfield shifted. Men walked lighter, jokes resurfaced in the mess tent. Helicopter crews stopped inventing excuses to avoid night missions. Yet beneath the relief was a quieter emotion, unease. Because the only thing more frightening than being forced to use the goggles was knowing that officers had abruptly decided no one should ever wear them again. "What did he see up there?" one pilot asked his gunner as they checked their bird before a sortie. "Same thing everyone else did," the gunner muttered, "only clearer." The comment wasn't meant to be heard by anyone else, but rumors traveled quickly when fear is the messenger. Some said the major saw figures rising from the trees. Others claimed he saw something following the helicopter for miles. A few believed he saw nothing at all, and that the real danger was what the goggles were doing to the minds of the crews. No one knew the truth, and Carter never clarified a program that officially never existed. Weeks later, a shipment of new equipment arrived from the States. Nothing unusual, just another delivery in a war that chewed up supplies faster than they could be sent. Except this time, someone noticed something missing. No red spectrum optics, no replacements, no upgraded versions, no spare parts. It was as if the program had been erased mid-sentence. When a junior officer casually asked about continuing the trials, Carter gave a sharp answer. "There will be no further testing. That's final." The officer didn't ask again. The men don't forget. Years later, most of the soldiers who tested the goggles didn't talk about them. Some believed the shapes they saw were hallucinations. Some believed they were real. Most preferred to let the memories fade into the night they came from. But none of them forgot how they felt during those flights. The pressure, the cold fear in their chests, the sense of being watched by something that wasn't supposed to be there. Even decades later, when veterans reunited and shared stories over coffee or quiet drinks, the subject rarely came up. And when it did, it came up in whispers, as if saying too much might bring the shapes back. The military never acknowledged the experiment. No files surfaced, no documents leaked. The program ended without ever officially beginning. But the men who wore the goggles and the officer who shut the program down never doubted what they saw, or what they almost saw, in that red-lit world above the jungle. Every story in war has two sides: what the mind experienced and what actually happened. The red spectrum goggles left the men shaken, that much is certain. But what caused their fear? What created the shapes they swore they saw, rising from the treetops, pacing the aircraft, or staring back at them through the fog? The answer depends on which side of the explanation you lean toward, because in this story, the line between psychology and the unknown is almost impossible to see. The rational explanation. 1. Optics distort reality. The prototypes weren't designed for long-term use. They weren't refined. They weren't even safe for regular deployment. Red spectrum wavelengths distort depth perception. They reduce clarity at long distances. They exaggerate outlines and shadows. Fog becomes layered. Branches look closer than they are. Movement slows down or accelerates unnaturally through the lens. In short, the goggles didn't show the world as it was. They showed the world as the device interpreted it. Add motion, like flying 100 feet above tree level, and illusions become inevitable. 2. Sleep deprivation changes the brain. Vietnam was a war of exhaustion. Many soldiers went days with barely an hour or two of rest. Pilots flew night after night, sometimes back-to-back missions. Door gunners slept with their boots on, waiting for the next scramble call. Lack of sleep slows cognitive processing, blurs the distinction between real and imagined increases. Visual misinterpretation heightens fear. Response amplifies silhouettes into threatening shapes. Studies show that after 48 hours without proper sleep, the brain begins to hallucinate. Some of the Vietnam crews were well past that threshold. 3. Stress-induced hallucinations. Combat is a constant adrenaline cycle. A pilot once described it this way: your mind learns to expect danger in every shadow. Eventually, the shadows start to look back. Hypervigilance is common in soldiers. It sharpens hearing, widens peripheral vision, and rewires the brain to search for threats that may or may not be there. Night vision goggles amplify this effect by magnifying flickers, dust heat, ripples, swaying branches, fog, turbulence. The brain, conditioned to survive, fills the unknown with meaning. It doesn't wait for the threat. It creates one. 4. Drug-induced perception errors. Then there were the so-called stay-awake pills. Many were later identified as pure amphetamines. These drugs suppress sleep, intensify fear, disrupt depth perception, cause auditory hallucinations, increase heart rate, heighten visual contrast, trigger paranoia, distort faces and shapes. Taken in combination with exhaustion, red spectrum distortion, and combat stress, hallucinations are not just possible, they are predictable. This is the rational side. Clean, structured, logical. But logic alone has trouble explaining one final detail. Multiple crews reported seeing the same shapes on different nights, in different locations, under different conditions, and that is where the second explanation begins. The unconventional possibility. On one, the human eye is blind to most of reality. We see only 0.200335% of the electromagnetic spectrum. The rest, infrared, ultraviolet, microwaves, radio waves, X-rays, gamma radiation, exists all around us but remains invisible. Devices that shift light wavelengths don't create new objects. They reveal what was already there, hidden from normal vision. What if there are structures, life forms, or energy patterns in the world that are simply outside our visible range? Not supernatural, just unseen. 2. Different wavelengths expose different worlds. Infrared shows heat signatures. Ultraviolet reveals markings on plants and animals invisible to humans. Certain wavelengths can expose atmospheric layers, energy gradients, thermal distortions, biological fluorescence, electromagnetic fields. So if the red spectrum goggles amplified an unusual wavelength, one not used before or since, they might have exposed layers of the environment we never observe. Fog might not be fog, branches might not be branches, shadows might not be empty, not because the soldiers imagined them, but because the goggles let them see what normal eyes cannot. 3. Animals detect things, humans. Miss cats and dogs often stare into corners or track movement humans can't perceive. Birds see ultraviolet patterns on plants and insects. Snakes detect heat signatures through infrared bits. Many creatures live partly in worlds we cannot access. What makes us so sure we are seeing the full picture? 4. Identical sightings are hard to ignore. The most troubling fact: different crews described nearly identical forms, long limbs, wing-like structures, shapes that seemed to rise from the treetops or glide through the fog. If these were random hallucinations, the details should vary wildly between soldiers. But they didn't. Patterns emerged: pacing movement, synchronized ascent, intelligent behavior, proximity to the aircraft, sudden disappearance when goggles were removed. This consistency is difficult to explain through psychology alone, which leaves one last possibility. The goggles didn't create illusions. They revealed something real, but outside the normal limits of human vision. Where does that leave us? The Red Spectrum program ended without answers. No scientist published a paper about the distortions. No officer wrote an official account. No technician explained what wavelength the goggles amplified. The prototypes were locked away, forgotten, or buried. All that remains are the testimonies of the men who wore them. And those testimonies fall perfectly between the rational and the unknown. Were they hallucinating? Probably. Were they seeing something real? Possibly. Did the goggles allow them to glimpse a layer of reality not meant for human eyes? That is the question the army never addressed, and the one the viewer must answer, because in the end, belief doesn't change what those soldiers saw. It only changes how you interpret it. War has a way of stretching the human mind beyond what it was designed to hold. It takes our senses, sight, sound, memory, and places them under pressures no ordinary life could ever recreate. And in that pressure, strange things happen. Some of those things can be explained. Others remain just outside our reach, like faint silhouettes moving at the edge of a flashlight beam. The soldiers who wore the Red Spectrum goggles were not mystics or dreamers. They were trained airmen, disciplined men, men who lived and died by what they could observe with their own eyes. And yet, when the darkness pressed close and the jungle rose beneath them like a living tide, they saw shapes that no manual, no training course, no scientific chart could explain. Maybe the light was bending, maybe their minds were exhausted, maybe fear filled the empty spaces the goggles revealed, or maybe the world is wider than our eyes allow us to see. Technology is a powerful thing. It expands our vision, sharpens our awareness, and uncovers layers of reality we never knew existed. But sometimes, when we push too far into the unseen pushes back. The army ended the program quietly, and perhaps that was the right choice. Not because the devices failed, but because they worked just well enough to show soldiers something they were never meant to witness. To this day, no one can say with certainty what those men saw rising from the tree line. Whether they were tricks of the mind, distortions of light, or something that simply exists beyond the narrow window of human sight. But here is the truth that matters. For the men in those helicopters, what they saw was real. Real enough to break their silence, real enough to haunt them, real enough to end the experiment forever. And perhaps that is where we should leave this story, not with answers, but with humility. Because the night still holds questions we haven't learned how to ask. And sometimes, the tools we build to reveal the world end up revealing ourselves instead. Our limits, our fears, and the fragile line between perception and reality. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you rest easy, and may clarity and peace find you in whatever darkness you're facing. Until next time, thank you for watching, and God be with you.